Welcome, everybody, and thanks again for your patience over the past couple of weeks as we worked our way through a small issue with scheduling and technology. Very, very happy to have you all here and to give us a chance to share a 2024 in review summary, as well as a handful of other things, some of which have already been done and posted on the website, in addition to some really exciting things that are underway over the next few months, and we'll have lots of more opportunity, lots of opportunity to speak about it more. So with that, if you are new here, would love to hear a hello in the chat and a little bit about what brought you here. Otherwise, we're going to launch right into the 2024, excuse my computer. Hmm, sorry. Right into the 2024 year in review. Rob, can I hand the mic over to you?
Yes, please. You
Super.
okay to advance the slides for me, Julie?
Yep,
Oh,
you got it.
okay. Fantastic. A review for everybody with respect to our steering committee. These are the members who have been working diligently as part of the leadership group, supported by just a truckload of folks providing support, especially in the data analysis working group and the manufacturers and EPD working group. So thank you all for attending. Next slide, please. A reminder of MEP 2040's mission, and this is a tweak that we actually made to this, and this is what now sits on our webpage. MEP 2040 is a movement to radically reduce total carbon emissions associated with building systems through collective action. So being aggressive with respect to what we do, and frankly, given the nature of what's going on in our country at the moment and how that might translate to the rest of the world, this can this is an economically advantageous way for us to be proceeding anyway. So while there's a lot of chatter and talk about you know uh, getting out of various different climate agreements and whatnot, the idea of doing things in an economically advantageous manner is the way that we want to continue to sort of present what we are doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so quick overview of our year in review summary. We're going to dig into some of the details a little bit later after I do a quick overview, because there's some great content that we think is very important to the signatories and supporters of MEP 2040. Next slide, please. In terms of our numbers, just the quick numbers of participation, we're up to 97 signatory firms now. We had 79 at the end of last year. 97 is what we're up to. We've got 59 supporting organizations. We had 42 last year, so a big jump there also. Then the active working group members, over 150 members. That's 50%, more than 50% increase over what we had last year. So when I say last year, apologies, I'm referring to 2023 since we're doing a 2024 review. So great work. Thank you all to all of you who have been participating in the working groups. Those that are active, we've got a couple that have been a little less active, such as the one that I'm in charge of, the communications. But here we are to sort of reboot and get things rolling for 2025. Next slide, please. In terms of how that looks for the signatory firms, here is the list. This is what appears up on the website at the moment. Andrew, I don't know if we've had any that have trickled in the last few days, but boy, we're just short of that
So close.
triple digit, so close. So we want to be encouraging others to be joining us, and that's all part of our sort of outreach. If you don't, if you know that you are a signatory and you feel like that your logo and name is not captured here, make sure that you send us a note either in the chat or a note to through the website so that we make sure that we get that captured. But I think we're pretty up to date with regard to the numbers. Next slide, please. These are the supporting orgs. So similar to what I just mentioned with regard to the signatories, this is an increase, as I said, about 40%. Over the previous end of year. Terrific to have all of you folks helping us with what we're doing, supporting us in the mission, participating. We know that there's a number of folks actually from the supporters group that also participate in the working group. So we thank you for your participation and contributions as well. Next slide, please. One of the important pillars that we have as part of MEP 2040 is for signatories to be submitting company plans, and we are now starting to get those rolling in. So thank you to all of those who have submitted their company plans. These are the firms that have submitted them that we have on our website, so they are shared so that we can share lessons learned, share ways of working. Our most recent addition is PAE. They've been very active actually on LinkedIn in terms of announcing their company plan being posted to MEP 2040. So we thank you for that sort of not just participation and sharing of your company plan, but providing the shout out, the outreach, and mentioning MEP 2040 so that we continue to grow the movement. The 11th quarterly forum, which was the one that we had about 3 or so months ago, we actually had a session on the company plans. So I just want to give a quick shout out to those firms, most of all of which are included in the list here, that actually presented either pieces of their company plan or information about their journey to developing their company plans. So thanks to TLC and BBR, Ewing Cole, BlueMac, IMEG, SOM, White and Company, and Windward for all participating in that last quarterly forum. It's often difficult to take that first step when you don't know what you don't know. And so having all of us as sort of a collective sharing the information on how you can take a step and take that step forward makes all of us better and helps the movement continue to move forward. Next slide, please.
Sure. I'll also add that all of the quarterly forums are recorded and on the website. So if you are interested in hearing more from that 11th quarterly forum, please do check it out at mep2040.org.
Excellent point. Thank you, Julie.
Yep.
A couple of signatory resources that were kind of hot and heavy and front and center last year through the manufacturers and EPD working group is the calls to action template letters that the group came up with. Those are posted also to MEP 2040 website, as well as specification language templates. That was a pretty important piece to put together draft language that can get dropped into MEP sections as part of some templated language around embodied carbon. So we would encourage everyone to go and take a look and grab that language. It's there for your use. We are trying to have a commonality within the industry, and as a collective leadership group, MEP 2040 signatory firms in the industry, this is a way for us to push that forward in a consistent manner. Next slide, please. A quick review of the MEP 2040 forum topics that we had back in March of 2024. We had the ASHRAE Decarb, One Click LCA, and USGBC research panel. Terrific panel on that. In June, the in-person ASHRAE summer meeting, specifying, procuring, and meeting embodied carbon MEP requirements. October, Q3, the company plans that Julie had mentioned and I had mentioned. So thanks for that. And then, of course, this our slightly delayed 2024 year in review. We'll get better this year with regard to making sure we meet the scheduling. This was our first sort of from scheduling mishap that we had. So lesson learned, and we certainly hope not to repeat that. Next slide. In terms of the on the podium, so a couple of these that I had mentioned, but a quick snapshot. MEP 2040 folks participating. This is just a snapshot of the total that we have out there. We know that there are a number of other presentations and a number of other conferences where MEP 2040 has been on the podium in some way, shape, or form. But the 2024 ASHRAE Winter Conference, the 2024 Decarb Conference, so you can see that there's a lot of alignment, obviously, with ASHRAE, the ASHRAE annual conference, Green Build Conference, and various different topics. Quick reminder to everybody that we are on. Go ahead to the next slide. We are on LinkedIn. Uh, Hopefully, you are seeing the posts. We're going to be talking about this particular topic, the MEP whole life carbon pilot, here in a few minutes. That Kaylee's going to present. But you want to make sure that you're following us, sharing our posts among your networks, so that we continue to grow the movement. Next slide. And another topic that we'll be speaking of here in just a minute when we bring Vincent to the dialogue is there is the opportunity now to donate. You can go to the website. There is a donate button. And this is now we'll talk in a couple of minutes about the sort of mechanism that we're utilizing for this, so that we can now begin to collect some money to help us with some administrative costs, to help fund some research and publication projects that we sort of have in the plans. So if you and or your firm have the ability, whether it's $1, whatever, right? We would certainly encourage everyone to donate. Next slide, please. As we look forward to 2025, the big topics, and a couple of these we are going to go into a lot more detail on here in just a minute. The beginner's guide to MEP embodied carbon, with a planned release date in April of 2025. There is a MEP whole life carbon pilot project that was launched yesterday. So thank you to those of you who are participating. If there are any stragglers that want to get in, Kaylee, I guess you can maybe address that when you sort of go over this. I think we wouldn't necessarily say no. Thank you, Kim, for the reminder. The embodied carbon publication date on Earth Day. Yes, date of significance. The ASHRAE CEBD strategic project alignment. We have these sort of aligned projects with ASHRAE around efficient refrigerant emission tracking, updated HVAC equipment service lives, MEP benchmarking, data research. We're trying, while we're not embedded within ASHRAE, we are aligned with ASHRAE, and we're trying to make sure that we're not going in different directions and not doing repetitive things, that we're working in lockstep with ASHRAE on certain strategic project alignments. There is an ECHO project update that I think Vince is going to walk us through. And then, of course, the MEP 2040 and Architecture 2030 partnership that we now have, which is something that Vince will also walk us through. And I think that is it from me on the 2024 look back. And I'm going to turn it over to, I think, Vince to lead us through the next section.
Yep, that's a co-part with Kaylee and Andrew too, I believe.
Right.
Go ahead, Kaylee.
Julie, if you could go to the next slide.
Yep.
So when we were incepted in 2021 as an organization, Carbon Leadership Forum very graciously offered to be our form of guidance and operational sponsorship. And we've operated in the nest of CLF, as Andrew likes to call it, until 2024, when we were searching for another operational, fiscal relationship to have with another organization, push us out of the nest, as Andrew likes to say, but we were ready to go as an organization. We've matured quite a lot. And we were looking for an equally altruistic organization, one that we had found so many similarities with Carbon Leadership Forum and wanted that same feel with the organization that we were choosing to operate under fiscally. And that will allow lots of different activities for us, which Vince will get into. But I think we are very lucky to find Vince and Architecture 2030. We had watched the way that Architecture 2030 was fostering the ECHO project, and we're so proud and happy for that to come to fruition. So we are now operating under Architecture 2030. So I'll let Vince talk a little bit more about what that means.
Thanks. And the Papa Bird, Andrew from CLF, wants to say anything, he's welcome to chime in here. Architecture 2030 is honored to support the MEP 2040 project. We've been part of this effort since its inception as a supporting organization. For those of you that don't know us very well, we've been around for almost 20 years as a 501c3 nonprofit focused on rapidly decarbonizing the global built environment. So very much our mission is your mission, with the work that MEP 2040 has been doing as a specific targeted arrow in the quiver. We're really pleased to be able to support this effort. This is not something new for us. We've done with this before as an agency with other emerging NGO partners, including the Carbon Leadership Forum, which, as it was leaving the University of Washington last year in 2024, we acted as the fiscal sponsor as they waited for their 501c3 designation from the federal government. So we're not new to this. We do have limited resources though, and so this fiscal sponsorship has a variety of different opportunities, but also we're still looking to support this through different mechanisms. So if we go to the next slide, Julie, please. As Kaylee mentioned, one of the particular pieces of why we would be taking on this effort is our values alignment. Architecture 2030, as I mentioned in our mission, is to focus on rapid decarbonization of the built environment. But we also have always been provided all of our resources at no cost to the industry. We've focused on thought leadership, resource development, research. We're funded by private philanthropy for the majority of our budget, and so we have a lot of flexibility in how we produce and share that information. We do have supporters and underwriters of our work, but not sponsors. And so it's really key to make sure that all of our information doesn't live behind a paywall, which is a values alignment piece with the MET 2040 initiative. This relationship also provides a number of opportunities to raise funds for the MEP 2040 initiative. Certainly, we talked a little bit. Rob mentioned the opportunity to donate. Architecture 2030 is our legal name is 2030 Inc. If you're looking for us within our 990s to see how we've operated for the last 20 years, but you can donate to us and have it be written off in your taxes, and that's as true for corporations as well. And so there is an opportunity there for receiving underwriting to support the MEP 2040 initiative, and that will be earmarked specifically for this effort if you do that through the website of the MEP2040.org. We also have the opportunity to include MEP 2040 in a variety of our program initiatives as we speak to philanthropy. So there are opportunities for both private sector, philanthropic and government grants into the future that go through our channels. And again, will be specific to the work. The other particular piece is that this is an opportunity to restructure a bit of the governance and leadership and participation opportunities to support MEP 2040. The steering committee has done a tremendous job over the last number of years in leading this fledgling effort that is going to be evolving. We are switching up some working groups. This is a natural evolution, and that the steering committee will now be revamped. We'll form a new advisory committee to Architecture 2030 about how we spend the funds that are received as part of the support of the initiative. And then the steering committee will be reworked in order to better facilitate the mechanics of and operations of the organization's efforts. So look out for more information about how you can continue to participate and play different roles within this new structure of leadership and participation. And then finally, I'll end Architecture 2030, given that our history within the NGO space in the built environment for the nearly 20 years, we have a lot of strategic relationships, certainly those that are local and national in the US, but particularly our international engagements. We've been an observer organization for the UNFCCC and gone to many of the COPs and SB events. We participate in the World Economic Forum. and a number of other international engagements. And so this provides an opportunity and a conduit through our network to better highlight the amazing work that is happening within this initiative, and also gives us opportunities to have more strategic partnerships with national and international organizations as we continue the movement forward. Next slide, please, Julie. And then just another plug. Again, I think the Papa Bird, Andrew Himes from CLF was doing a tremendous amount of volunteer donated work from his own time and CLF's time. And so we'll continue to be grassroots and lead. And my colleague, Erin McDade, who's on the call today, our senior program director, and myself will do what we can to support the MEP 2040 with our operating budget. But we do need support to continue to operate MEP 2040 into the future, to provide the administrative resources, but as Kaylee mentioned, also to support research and grant other strategic projects. So please speak with your organizations. Again, it's text, can write it off, and you can go to that website to learn more. If you have any questions about Architecture 2030, our history, and the work that we do, please reach out to us, and we'll be happy to answer any questions as you bundle this request and opportunity through your organizations and firms. And I think I'm up next, but we're transitioning into more of a project and alignment relationships. As many of you are aware, MEP 2040 is one of many initiatives, I believe 12, that has participated in something called the ECHO project. ECHO stands for Embodied Carbon Harmonization and Optimization. This was an effort that started nearly 2 years ago with the support of some seed funding from the Wholesome Foundation for Sustainable Construction, Columbia University, and the Blackstone Ranch Institute, which was facilitated by a number of convening partners, including CLF, Building Transparency, Architecture 2030, and U.S. Green Building Council. Next slide. We brought a number of parties together, and over the last year and a half, we were able to focus on alignment of metrics and the schema associated with recording embodied carbon information and attributes of buildings and building systems. That was launched in September on the one on the right, led by Building Transparency. A schema is essentially the taxonomy, the values that we're collecting about all of these different applications and how they can better sync and align with each other. And then that was produced into something called GitHub, which is a code repository. And now we're hoping that those fields will be implemented by the various rating systems and industry programs that participated in ECHO and beyond. And so the Building Transparency will continue to see updates to that schema as defined by the ECHO group moving forward, but we're hoping to see that now being implemented. On the left, you see the project lifecycle assessment requirements. This was a subgroup led by the Carbon Leadership Forum, and this is a tremendous document. I highly recommend you look at this and read it in detail, including the appendices. This really shows where we've had alignment within all of our multidisciplinary industries on embodied carbon, what we've agreed to report at a minimum level, what would be best practice to report beyond that, how to break it up. I always talk about these are all the ingredients to making your dinner, but sometimes people want the cilantro on the side. They don't like it in the mix. So this talks a little bit about how to break up some of those pieces according to the LCA, but it also talks in the appendices about things that we're not completely aligned on yet as an industry, which is where there's potential for more work to be done. So these are great accomplishments after 2 years of voluntary collaboration between 12 different initiatives, sort of unheard of in our industry when NGOs don't really have the budget to communicate and align with each other. So this is really a historic moment in time. Next slide, please. There will be a new leadership structure at ECHO moving into 2025. CLF will continue to convene and facilitate the steering committee meeting, which includes many of those organizations. Building Transparency will continue to focus on the schema work. But ULI has stepped up also now to facilitate a working group to have on public comments and standards. We know that there's ASH-rated 240p, which is everybody's got eyes and ears on and a lot of input into. And so ULI will help ECHO's partners provide comments into that and other policies as they emerge. And USGBC is going to lead groups around whole building LCA guidance. That's the first half of 2025. If that stuff gets done on time, we'll see. Next slide, please. Then the second half will change a little bit. BT's role will be roughly the same, but Carbon Leadership Forum will start looking at the opportunities for shared databases. How can we align all of these different programs and initiatives under similar data feeds? And it's about opposed to just the taxonomy. ULI will focus on real estate as they well, you would expect from ULI, but is a really important effort given the existing building stock. And then USGBC will focus on building specific baselines. I'm imagine leading off of some of the work that CLF has started over the last number of years. So that's the Echo update from me and more on the governance. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'll put my email in the chat.
So, Haley, before you go on, I'd just like to chime in following what Vince had to say about the fiscal sponsorship from Architecture 2030 and about CLF. As CLS representative to MEP 2040, I've been part of the initiation, evolution, and further development of MEP 2040 over the last, what has it been, 3 years now, more than 3 years. And from CLS perspective, this is an extraordinarily interesting and really wonderful moment in the history of this initiative. It's an indication that we're ready as a collection of organizations, companies, and individuals. MEP 2040 is on at the stage where we're ready to grow up. We've been doing a lot of gestating and developing relationships and doing some hard work. The most important strength of MEP 2040 have been the literally thousands of hours of volunteer time that have been contributed by all of the members of the working group and by the steering committee. And the commitment of CLF in this regard is to enable and ensure that MEP 2040 can be independent and strong and move forward with a great deal of momentum and contribute significantly to the decarbonization of the entire industry. And so what I want to do is just put a pin on what first Rob said and then what Vincent said. This is a movement that is supported by the members and contributors and participants in the movement. So, what that means, I think, is that while it's certainly possible that at some point we'll get some outside funding from foundations or from grants, the most significant financial contributions to the ongoing work of MEP 2040 will be from MEP design firms, particularly MEP design firms and individuals who are employed by or associated with those organizations. And so, a big question that any of you ought to be able to answer, I think, in the next 12 months, as you approach your own organizations for potential support of MEP 2040, is that there are three key accomplishments that we're looking forward to in the next year, year and a half. The first one is what you'll be hearing about next in this meeting, which is the MEP Embodied Carbon Guidance document, the publication and implementation of the Beginner's Guide to MEP Embodied Carbon and the case studies that we've already heard the publication date is scheduled for late Q1 or early Q2 of this year. Secondly, tool integration, integrating MEP 2040 whole life carbon data schemas and methodologies into design and analysis tools. And finally, benchmarking. That is, launch the MEP 2040 whole life carbon benchmarking project. All three of those projects will be absolutely essential as we move forward into the next year and are the hallmark of what MEP 2040 as a decarbonization movement for MEP designers is all about. So your money will go to support those three accomplishments and enable the staff support and organizational development and the ongoing meetings and the hard work behind the scenes that's required to make all of that stuff happen. And from CLF's point of view, I will continue to be part of the MEP 2040 steering committee and part of the fundraising campaign and all the rest of it. I'm really happy about that, and CLF will continue to be a significant supporter and deeply appreciative a part of the MEP movement. And I guess I'd just finally like to say, by the way, a few days ago, I reached my 75th birthday. This is the first time in my life I've been referred to as a daddy bird. And It sounds kind of cool, actually. I may begin to use that term, though I don't know how my daughter's going to feel about it. I'll have to explore that with her in another conversation. So now I'll turn it right back over to you, Kaylee. I think you're next.
Um, Thank you so much, Andrew. We so appreciate you in particular, as well as CLF, but where would we be without you? Your juggling, your green hair. Love you. Um, all right, I will go ahead and share my screen. All right, Kim will be kicking us off with the Genesis for the Beginner's Guide to Embodied Carbon, as well as our co-authorship.
So we've heard a lot this morning about partnerships and probably the partnership that gives us the greatest currency, if you will, in the work that we're doing is the partnership that we have with Carbon Leadership Forum. Without question, CLF is the voice for embodied carbon, especially in North America. And one of the efforts that you're going to hear more about today is this beginner's guide to the MEP embodied carbon, and the fact that Carbon Leadership Forum has embraced the work that MEP 2040 has done on this to the point that they're going to become co-authors with the guide is extremely important. This places the beginner's guide sort of on the forefront of what's happening with embodied carbon in the construction industry in North America. And I think what you're going to see is that this will be a seminal work that influences not only what we do in the MEP field, but is also going to ripple into the rest of the building industry as a way to show people, number one, what the impact of MEP embodied carbon is, and two, that there are lessons being learned right now that are going to ripple out in terms of the benchmarking study that Andrew spoke so eloquently about, and how this will go forward to really enhance what we're doing in the industry around embodied carbon. Kaylee?
Thanks, Kim. We're very excited to share this work with all of you. This was a presentation that we actually gave at Greenbuild this year to introduce the topic, the work, to show the breadth of what has happened through the construction of the guide, and that is only continuing to be honed and polished by our work with Carbon Leadership Forum, which is why the publication date's been pushed back a bit, but for beautiful reasons. We actually wanted Pi Day to be the publication date because we're all engineering nerds, but moved it to Earth Day, equally important. Maybe second to Pi Day. So start off with the genesis of this guide. How many brilliant minds does it take to simplify MEP embodied carbon? I think this is something that we've struggled with as an industry. Is it's so many small parts. How could we possibly quantify everything properly? But really trying to embrace the Pareto principle of the 80-20 rule and really focus on the parts that we believed as MEP engineers mattered, how we would approach that question, and then pairing that with the best of life cycle assessment expertise. That's what we've tried to pare down in this guide. You see pictures of all of the authors of this guide below, as well as contributors who are not pictured here, and reviewers of this guide. This list has actually gotten much longer in terms of the review space. Louise Himo from Introba, SIBS TM65 originator, also did a very thorough review here. Leila Shankar has done a review. So we've had lots of eyes on this. So I think that we will be sharing some very exciting advancements with all of you in the very near future. But what did this take initially? First, I think just thinking about the number of disciplines and consultants that are engaged on the MEP piece of the day one embodied carbon. That is mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, plumbing engineers, the MEP acronym. However, there's also fire protection, lighting, fire alarm, low voltage, AV, IT, security, comms, and vertical transportation. Those are a lot of different minds to kind of pull all of that knowledge together. And I cannot tell you how much I personally learned while constructing this guide with all of these different experts. I knew very little about vertical transportation before we endeavored to create this guide. Now I know a whole lot more than I thought I ever would, in the best way. So I think you'll appreciate the breadth and depth that we put into this while also keeping it lean. Thinking about the bill of materials associated with MEP is another piece of the pie here, because if you think about the categorical pieces, you've got piping as a whole. However, underneath that, you have lots of different raw materials that go into that, as well as different kinds of insulation. Same thing for ductwork and wiring. Electrical equipment has lots of different categories that would potentially go under there. Mechanical equipment, that list could be hundreds of items long in terms of all of the different pieces of mechanical equipment that we have on all of our different systems across different project topologies. Geothermal, that was a really interesting piece of this study because the initial case study we performed had a geothermal system. So thinking about all of that additional structural material as well as the MEP material. Plumbing fixtures, we're all familiar with that as humans. Vertical transportation, thinking about the elevators, escalators, moving walkways, the difference in embodied carbon there, as well as lighting and all the different fixtures and components. Now pair that list on the right side with the one on the left. Who owns which part of that under each of these different consultant disciplines? And thinking about the fact that piping spreads across mechanical, plumbing, and fire protection, they all have that within their remit. So thinking about the contributions from each discipline was incredibly important, on top of the fact that you have piping as an entity as a whole. And we had lessons to learn actually through each of those discipline lenses when thinking about the same material. Now, for this study, this number 54 is outdated. I think the number is closer to 70 now in terms of the number of environmental products we had to source. Now, if you go through something like the, I don't know, Tracy system and look at the MEP EPDs that are provided to North America, very few. And they certainly do not cover all of these categories that we went through. So we needed to expand our search to a global pool of EPDs. We used uncertainty to account for the fact that I'm not actually sourcing my, I don't know, fans from Europe, but I need to use that factor and then use uncertainty thereafter to account for the difference. So that has been taken account here, but we were really serious about wanting to at least understand how could we collect all of these EPDs? Where were the major gaps in terms of EPDs in North America? I could speak for pumps in particular. There were no pumps that weighed more than, I think it was like 30 kilograms. How much does your average pump weigh on a project? Hundreds of pounds, right? Things like that where we're missing a big scale in terms of which EPDs are actually available. And this will give us a good reason to actually combat that chicken and egg problem. If there aren't enough EPDs, we can't do an LCA. You can with the components that exist out there, but we can also do better. And this helped us to align what those gaps were so that we could call them out and make sure that people are addressing those holes specifically. So looking at the product stage, just your A1 to A3 embodied carbon, we had a case study through University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign Weimer Hall, which the university graciously allowed us to share those case study results for. So this is just a sampling of the potential embodied carbon at day one for a university. Now, this university was also partially run on central plant, so you can imagine how those results would scale a little bit. The piping alone was 34 kilograms CO2 per meter squared. 500 is the number we all have in our head, and that's usually structure and enclosure. Piping alone is 30. Mechanical equipment is another 30. Wiring is almost 18. Electrical equipment sitting at 9. Ductwork at 7 because it's a water-driven system. You can see how those numbers would stack up to something significant. And I think that we all know that if you look even at the opacity of a model, when you're looking through it, and all of the stuff that we put in, it's just all hidden under ceiling cavities and on the roof and in plant rooms that no one sees. But it is significant when you add up the sum of the parts. Also, even digging down into which pieces of equipment actually had the most influence on the embodied carbon. in all the studies that I've performed, it's always been the air handling units because they're heavy. They're very heavy pieces of equipment that tend to take up a big chunk of that equipment embodied carbon. So just looking at the different levels of all the different component parts that we have to play with. Piping in particular was our biggest learning opportunity because piping, if you think about the fact that sprinkler pipes are not modeled in half of the country, so you're missing a lot of carbon steel piping. The fact that you might have some existing piping shown. We actually had 12-inch existing pipes running around the outside of this site that I erroneously counted. And when we were looking at the by size charts, everyone was like, hold on, Kaylee, why is there so much 12-inch piping? That's not right. We realized that that was all existing piping. So checking your phases in your model is very important, but also being able to QA yourselves and say what doesn't look or feel right. So looking at actually the contribution of different systems within piping. So under mechanical, we had all of the horizontal geothermal piping, all the vertical piping, which was accounted for separately, glycol, steam, chilled water, chilled beam specific loops for the chilled water, condensate, condenser water. That's a lot to put under there, but understanding the relative contributions of those discipline systems was very important. And then the sprinkler mains alone having a significant contribution without the branch piping modeled. Beyond day one, MEP embodied carbon, you need to think about all of the life cycle phases. So we've listed out here all of the life cycle phases through Rick's guidance of, going into around construction emissions in particular. You've got the pre-construction demolition. You've got construction activities, meaning the actual equipment that you bring onto site, the emissions they burn, and then the waste and waste management. That's not what we necessarily needed to focus on. Again, going back to that 80-20 principle, we thought, what do we have data for today? What can we effectively measure today? And what can we apply some factors from existing data sets to get us to the point where we are effectively measuring a 5.3 waste, which is what most projects do. They're just not as transparent about the individual stages that they're measuring for. Also doing the same for B1, focusing on refrigerant emissions, maintenance and repair, replacement. It's particularly important since we're replaced very often in MEP. Operational energy obviously is very important. And then thinking about the end of life, we had data for transport and disposal that we were able to take into account, as well as uncertainty. So really focusing on 80-20 principle, what we thought would move the needle and matter for us. So just looking at A1 to A3 for the project case study that we had, this is an example of the whole building potential at day one. So this is embodied content only. No machines have been turned on. There is no operational energy. 124 kg CO2 attributed to MEP. That is larger than the enclosure for this building and about half of the structure.
Yes, good morning. My name's Mike Weishaupt. I'm with TheraPro Painters, and I just thought.
Okay. I'm gonna keep moving. Then for the relative comparison here of the structure, I thought this was a really interesting way of kind of putting this into context. So the structure of this building weighed 10 million kilograms. That's expected. We know that structural systems are heavy, which is why we focus so much on them. Typically takes 5 EPDs to accomplish a structural LCA because it only has 5 component parts by product, but weighing 10 million kilograms. That ratio, then, if you compare that back to the embodied carbon for the structure, comes out to 0.25. That's close to what Portland cement actually is as a ratio. So heavy stuff, lower embodied carbon for that heavy stuff. The MEP systems, however, for this building weighed 358,000 kilograms. That compared to the embodied carbon turns into a ratio of 3.21. That's very close to steel's embodied carbon, which makes sense. Our systems are made of metal, but doing a kind of gut check to figure out if those figures actually checked out. Then when we started to add up all of the life cycle stages attributed to embodied carbon, so not operational, so we're not adding B6 in here, no energy in here, the MEP results actually after B4, which you can see on this little bar chart, have turned into 433 kilograms CO2 per meter squared. That is almost the entire budget, if you will, for structure and enclosure, but attributed to MEP systems. Now, that is because our systems are replaced 2, 3, 4, with some systems being replaced 6 times, electric radiators on this building. So that is the scale of what we're dealing with in terms of replacement embodied carbon, which you also have to take into account when you do that, the transport to site, the decommissioning of those materials that would have happened from the previous installation. So this just shows the scale of MEP embodied carbon throughout the whole life of the building. And most of our building stock already exists, right? We are currently doing these renovations on buildings. Now, when you add in the whole life carbon picture of adding those operational emissions back in from B6 and B7, the MEP contribution here was 1,200. And that is not maybe a surprise to anyone in terms of that 75% contribution, but I think for a long time we weren't including MEP as a part of this puzzle overall. So compared to structure at 274 and enclosure at 106, which didn't adjust from their numbers from A1 to D because they don't emit anything during the B6 phase, but that MEP needs to be a part of this conversation because we hold 75% of the building in our hands. So back to the guide, in terms of the guidance that we produced, having the takeoff prescriptive guidance was the most important part of this guide from our view. Since there was a group of about 15 of us working together regularly, getting that guidance around the nuance of how different systems needed to be measured after they were modeled. I think, and this came up actually yesterday during the pilot, there's probably a whole slew of guidance that will come out of this in terms of recommendations for how to set up your BIM model, because it could be better, but this gives you the guidance for the in-between things of what is modeled, what's not modeled, and how to take account of that, and us taking account of that actually in benchmarking so that we're comparing apples to apples. The materials. Oftentimes, you cannot trust the material that was initially applied to things like pipes or ducts. So having some guidance in between to say this is the typical material for domestic cold water, and you're able to look up the typical amount of insulation. Granted, you would want to look at specific building codes, ask your engineer, look at specs. All of those items still exist in terms of resources, but giving someone a starting point in terms of what materials they can expect for those systems is very helpful and necessary. As well as some of the kind of general feel for the embodied carbon of different materials in different spaces, so you know the relative potency when you're just looking at something like piping, ductwork, or wiring. The other piece was going through specific guidance of A4 through D, trying to use all of the guidance that exists out there for MEP. It's not much, but of what does exist, we used a combination of Rick's guidance from the UK, which is very well developed. It's on its second iteration, ASHRAE 240P. It's still a draft, evolving, but has some relevant guidance for North American figures, and then also supplementing with TM65 data for MEP component specifics around things like waste transport figures, so that we have the best information for all of those different life cycle phases and modules. So we went through that specifically, as well as the case study in terms of the results, and then some specific calls to action around what we would like to see after this guide comes out. We want to see more EPDs in specific spaces. We want to see MEP added in as something other than optional for LEED and ILFI, so that it is actually mandatory to measure this and not just optional, because it is such a large contributor to the whole life carbon puzzle. So as we've mentioned, the planned release date for this guidance, which should say 2025 on that cover, is April 22nd, 2025. We are going through a very thorough review right now with CLF. Just received the first 29 pages of comments. Well, the 29 pages with comments on them. So we'll be going through those. We're very happy to be working with Megan Lewis and Aurora Jensen at CLF in terms of going through the best advice that we can give people around each of those different steps and filling in some of the gaps with tool guidance and LCA diagrams, things like that. Moving on to our whole life carbon.
Kaylee, do you want to take a quick break and a quick breath? Because that was kind of stunning what you just presented.
Yeah, let's take a second
The
to talk.
the amount of effort, and so many of you who are actually in this virtual room here participating in that work product. And this is not your day job, right? So, I mean, it's absolutely stunning the amount of effort that has gone into that. And I just, personally want to thank everybody for their participation in that to date. And, maybe if there's a couple of questions we want to take around this before we get into into the last section on the pilot.
Yeah,
If anybody wants to raise their hand, if they have a question that they want to ask about this work product in particular. I can't see all three screens myself, but.
So
Rob and Kaylee, it looks like we've got a couple in the chat I can read for you if you guys can get to them.
Go for Josh.
Yeah, it sounds like piping, ductwork, and installation are the first products we should request EPDs for. Are there any other products we should focus on, Kaylee?
So I would say of piping and ductwork, I would love actually a sector EPD for those because they tend not to be manufacturer specific around piping and ductwork at least. So I think that should be the push we give. Great to have individual producers of those items, but Josh, I'm sure you could speak to this further.
So when you're saying sector specific, you mean an industry-wide EPD potentially?
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. There are some out there that are starting to go down this path, but like you said, it's not as frequent as some of the others. You're starting to see more mechanical work, certainly electrical wiring and some fixtures and fit outs and stuff like that having individual EPDs. So industry-wide may be a way to go. But again, a lot of it has to do with the metal that is being procured, and sometimes they're getting it. They don't specifically know like what plant the metal is coming from. They're getting it through distributors. Another question here is the glycol broken out for its embodied carbon, similar to how refrigerants are broken out?
We did not break out the glycol separately. It was just the piping for it in this study.
Okay. And then Scott says, we need an industry-wide EPD before we can start advocating for lower carbon options. Correct. Kaylee, I think I can take that one very quickly. Believe it or not, that was sort of the way things were going when LEED version 4 first came out was, hey, get us an industry-wide. And still, as Kaylee mentioned, is still a valuable tool in lots and lots of ways. But believe it or not, the thing that has moved the needle most that I have personally seen is individual specifications from builders, from building owners, from building operators, from engineers stating we need an EPD for this and give them time. That's the one thing to note is EPDs do take at least a year to produce most of the time for these complicated products. It takes, 4 to 6 months to do a life cycle assessment, a couple months to potentially get the EPD verified by the program operator. So asking for it tomorrow is probably not something that's going to happen. But as we have on MEP 2040, we've got letters that you can borrow/steal, use for free, and send them out to folks that you're looking for. We also have a specification that lists things that you can ask for EPD. So you don't need an industry-wide EPD to start asking for lower carbon, or at least understanding the carbon of the materials that you're grabbing. Kaylee, I'd love your opinion as someone who's out there doing it.
I mean, there are lots of different EPDs available for different types of equipment, so it kind of depends where you're looking. I think that in terms of the chiller space, there are quite a few EPDs out there that we can start to compare them to each other, and you have enough selection to be able to choose an appropriate one for your project, which is really nice. So I would say it depends on how many things you have and how functionally equivalent they are. I think that's the piece that's a little tricky for MEP is the functional units, because the PCRs haven't been very well developed. It's understanding what is functionally equivalent to your product on your project before you can start to make those comparisons to other material that's out there. Happy with either an industry-wide or a product EPD at this point. We'll take it all. But I think focusing on specific areas where there's potentially really high impact, but then very few EPDs is where we were looking as part of this guide. I would say insulations, that is the one thing there is plenty of. Owens Corning did a great job of providing lots of, there's another, Johns Manville also has lots of EPD for insulations. So for piping and ductwork specifically, which is very nice to be spoiled for choice on those ones.
Yeah, definitely a lot of the folks who were quote unquote involved in LEED early, as EPD was a credit area to help buildings get their LEEDs points, as people love to refer to them. So it always started to move some of those insulations and piping. I know someone just put in the chat, they recently found an EPD, sorry, for a plumbing fixture that was made available on a vendor's website. I'm just asking as well. Functional units, hugely important, as you said, Kaylee. I did answer a question about PCRs earlier. If there is not a PCR and someone is using a product category, is using 21930 as their product category rule, which you're allowed to do, to make sure you understand what functional units, so that you're not comparing, Granny Smith apples to Macintosh apples. They have different flavors and they are different, even though they're both apples. So anyway, Rob, I think that's it with the things
We've got, we've got a hand up, Saham, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. I was just wondering if the guide is North American specific.
It is North American specific in only that the assumptions that we've made, which is actually not in the guide, it's more in the workbook documents. Things like A4 for transport, they're based on North American distances from East Coast, West Coast of the US. But there are very specific tables that are comparable to that are available through UK guidance, for example. They give you like from Europe, from Asia, which is not quite as relevant to the US. So that's where we've deviated a bit in terms of this guidance is now specific to this. However, we source EPDs from everywhere. So your uncertainty also would depend on the project, right? Because maybe I did spec a Grundfos pump and it's coming from somewhere in Europe, right? That is possible, but it would vary by project just as much as it would by region.
Thank you.
Okay, Haley, do you want to carry on with this next section?
But you said that there are EPDs available for ductwork and piping. Who is making those? And then, for ductwork, I think that a lot of that is shop fabricated. And so, it would be hard to get a product specific EPD for that. So is there another calculation method we should look at?
So there are not many pipe or duct EPDs. What we were saying was that we would advocate for an industry-wide EPD in that case because of the shop fabricated aspect of piping and ductwork. The values that we were using at present was a combination of EPDs by manufacturer in some cases, particularly around ductwork, where there are things like a 4-inch spiralized duct EPD that does exist out there. That's not the ideal situation, obviously, but having some variety around ductwork. And then there were a combination of one-click EPDs and TM65 raw materials for copper, steel, things like that are available. So trying to use a combination of what is available out there. But again, those materials are a bit closer to raw materials, with the exception of PVC, PEX, things like that. So some variety in that space, but it would be great to have an industry-wide EPD.
And for the raw materials, like carbon intensity factors, are you still looking at the SIBC kind of TM65 source with the table that shows the different carbon intensities per different material?
That was not what we used for the study. We tried to use EPDs when possible, but the values are not that far off if you did a comparison of the two side by side, which is to be expected, right? Because of the materials they're made out of.
Thank you.
All right. Our whole life carbon pilot. So we began this pilot process in tandem with the production of the guide. So the guide was complete from our end, having a very thorough peer review. However, we've started the pilot with 32 projects. There are 40 participants in this pilot, which we were very happy about. If you missed the boat on that, you can shoot me an email or just mention it in the chat, and you can always join. Our bare minimum for this pilot was that you have a Revit model that's in at least LOD 200, so most of the MEP systems modeled, that it's not core and shell ideally, so that you're getting the full picture of MEP with lots of different topologies that are part of this study. The idea is that it would be long form, that we're all learning together, that this is a learning process that we're hoping to actually advance the knowledge that we were able to collectively gain and only make that better through having lots of different project types. Even yesterday, the 3 airports that are a part of this study all had the same conundrum of we all have the same amount relatively of TI space that's not modeled here. Well, that might be relative actually for all airports moving forward, is that you don't have the fit out for the individual spaces, but that's good because that gives us another level of parity, I guess, among a certain topology. So I'm excited about finding things like that throughout this study. So first, we started off with building functional equivalence. What makes your buildings similar to each other or not? Academic building versus laboratory versus an office, right? They would all have slightly different takes on the needs of the occupants of the space. Sensible and lane gains would be different. And also taking account of the climate zone, things like that, where we know that the MEP systems will certainly be adjusted based on where they are in the world. So we focused on that piece. Our cadence is that we do 1 week of this is what we need to be filling out in the project template and the takeoffs we need to be performing. And then the week after we do Q&A. So that cadence is going to continue. After this 2 weeks section, we're going to move into the A1 to A3 takeoffs, starting with piping and ductwork with Riot Ross and I, moving into wiring, equipment, fixtures, and geothermal. Those will each have 2 weeks so that you have time to actually do the takeoff and the study, and then come back with your questions. After that, we'll be moving into A4 through C calculations, going through each life cycle phase, checking the assumptions that are there to make sure that we've made the best selection for your project, whether it's an East or West Coast based project, or if you need an international data set, being able to adjust those as needed. And then getting our benchmarking results and collating all of our findings, and finally doing some analysis on that. So we're really excited to go on this journey with everyone because there is so much to learn. I think that getting these initial takeoff studies that's just the tip of the iceberg, because where we want to get to is that we're able to make whole life carbon assessments analysis where we can actually say this is a better choice for you for all the carbons, not just thinking about the embodied carbon of your facade, for example, but putting that into context for the MEP embodied carbon and the operational carbon. Frankly, all of those need to be considered simultaneously. It is the biggest gap we have as an industry. We can start to address that, and we're really excited about that possibility. We'll also be sharing insights from the pilot on the LinkedIn channel every week. So stay tuned for those. Even if you're not a part of the studies, hopefully we can give some nice takeaways that lead up to our release of the guide, just in terms of different design considerations you might make along the way when considering different factors. And then finally, this is the spread of all of the different projects that we have as part of the pilot, which we're very excited about. And I think getting some, coalescing around education and office, for example, will give us some better insight in terms of what were the shifts, lots of different climate zones also, which I'm very excited about. So being able to see that deviation or looking at different system types for those buildings. So really exciting insights ahead. Can't wait to share those findings with all of you. And I know for the Q&A portion, we can talk about the pilot and the guide and things like that. We also wanted to know what you were interested in terms of forum content, what you want more of when we're moving into 2025 for our next quarterly forums, the next 3 for the year, I guess. What topics you want to know more about, who you want to hear from in terms of manufacturers or owners, or those different perspectives that we have brought into this forum in the past. what questions or thoughts do we all have?
There's a request to share the email for who to email for the pilot. If somebody wants to be a participant, Kaylee, is that your email address?
Tim shared my email address in the chat.
Oh, he did. Oh, hey, he's fast. Got it.
Don't be shy.
Rob, something in the chat. I would love to see a presentation by a company on why they signed on to MEP 2040, what their 2040 goal is, and how they plan to achieve it.
I think that that would be an interesting topic for a forum to gather a group, not just I mean, we probably the most similar to something like that is what we had in our Q3 forum, which was the company plan forum. And I think there was a little bit of a taste from some of the presenters around why they signed on to the MEP 2040, but something more specific around, you know, the whys of the commitment to the 2040 commitment would certainly be an interesting topic, I think.
We've also received a lot of questions around requirements for this commitment. And I think that we've always been a bit shy about saying that we're requesting specific benchmarking data or anything like that because we didn't have an exact format to follow for that in terms of being able to get apples to apples data to even make effective comparisons. That's changing, right? So I think that as we move through 2025, move through the pilots, my personal goal is that every one of us as a signatory, meaning you're an MEP design firm, would perform at least one study just to dip your toe in the pond so that we can start to figure out what the differences are to be able to move that whole life carbon picture and truly decarbonize. We are going to need data and we're providing that pathway for everyone. And hopefully we can all be a part of that benchmarking exercise.
So like as we kind of glean more info on data, it is something sort of like what SE 2050 does coming up, like, report your embodied carbon data for MEP and then, publish annual updates to your plan, something to that effect.
Yes, that's exactly what we
Right
would.
on. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And the insights that SE 2050 has been able to make in terms of simple things like your columns being spaced closer together means that you have lower embodied carbon. We want to be able to pull the MEP equivalent of that across for all of our stakeholders so that we start to understand what those trade-offs are. We can't do that without data.
Awesome. Yeah, I feel like that's so critical with it being sort of like in the beginning stages, just kind of exponentially increase the level of accuracy in the data and willingness to actually do this.
Yeah, and I think we had a bit of a fear previously about doing that because things can become, and particularly for myself, I work for a British firm. I'm watching results come out of Greater London Authority where it is required, but people do it at the equivalent of schematic design for MEP, which is scary to me because you have modeled hardly anything at that point. So seeing these results that look comparable to each other because everyone's using the same benchmark data is not helpful. So I think for us having a baseline of being at least LOD 200 to LOD 300, you've got most of your systems modeled, things like that where apples to apples comparisons are possible. We're dealing with a lot more parts than structures. So it's a little bit more difficult to figure out what we wanted to measure, but we already think we know what trends we'll see in the data, but I hope that we find new insights along this path. It's an exciting time.
For the industry-wide EPDs, that just seems like something that requires funding and then some, stakeholder support. So, is there a trade association for, or a union for the sheet metal or the piping that we would develop that industry-wide EPD, similar to the Steel Institute or the Concrete Reinforcement Institute that puts out those industry average EPDs? Who's the trade group that does that? And then, recently I found a EPD developer that is a little bit less costly. Still it's, whatever, $25,000 for the first EPD and then $5,000 for each additional EPD after that within the same, product lineup, assuming they're doing different gauges of the same pipe work or something like that. You could get a bunch of, and they do it pretty quick. They promise a 120-day turnaround. So would you guys do that with funding, or are you looking for somebody else to do that with funding? What's the plan of action there?
I think you had the right first point there, is that we need to find the equivalent of an NRMCA for piping and ductwork that would be willing to spearhead this effort. And I think it's a bit more fragmented for piping and ductwork. But that's the type of research that we need to be doing to find the right partners to be able to produce those documents. It is likely not MEP 2040 that's going to be involved in the actual production, but I think in terms of maybe coalescing all of those bodies together and getting them to work together to create those, I'm sure that's something that Josh is familiar with in his work at WAP. He could speak to a bit.
Yeah, so again, there are a couple different piping associations, not necessarily the exact one, Ben's, that you're talking about. These are more on the plastic side of stuff that are trying to start this process as we speak. So again, some areas are doing that. Additionally, you had mentioned some more rapid pace of EPDs. EPD production, life cycle assessment production, is being softwareized as we speak. So, we love obviously to be able to press buttons and have things produced. That is what has happened in the concrete industry. It's why there's 73,000 batch level EPDs right now for concrete. Basically, you build a building and you can have your batch of concrete have an EPD on it tomorrow. We are working towards that with more complicated products, where that, 6 weeks could be a heck of a lot shorter, hopefully, and certainly not $25,000 moving forward, hopefully, as we start to do more and more. Again, the one thing I will tell you as an LCA practitioner that we try and talk with people as they move forward wanting to do EPDs is bunching these things together. So when they try to do one, it comes across like you're mentioning, Ben, it can be very expensive. But when you're putting a bunch of them together, similar type products, you can start getting multiples of these out at once, because you're gathering a lot of the facility data that's the same, a lot of their supply chain data is very similar, things of that nature. So when we're working with these organizations, or they come to us to ask, because you folks are asking for this data, we try to explain to them to do as much as possible coming out of that facility today, do as much that it gets this supply chain done, so that, again, it can be on a cost per unit basis. It's much less expensive than some of the numbers you're probably hearing.
Yeah, if I may, a couple other things are happening. AHRI definitely has discussion about that. Now, whether they want to get into piping and ducts, we have to see. And another organization, one of the national labs, like Argonne National Lab, they do have a grids database. Whether they're gonna adventure into those elements, we'll have to wait and see. Especially, we all saw the Secretary of Energy this morning discuss about the information he released this morning. So we have to see what's gonna happen.
Then I saw a question in the chat from Jamie about seeing or attending a workshop of how to do the takeoffs. Said seeing the results one thing in a benchmark, but your own findings from starting from BIM to actual weights and then applying EPDs. That's exactly what we're doing in the working group that's working through the pilot. Those takeoff pieces start in 2 weeks. With piping and ductwork, and then we're moving on to wiring, conduit, cable tray. So we are recording those sessions. We will be posting them to YouTube at some point. But I think finding our lessons learned through there is also an objective of this pilot, but getting everyone to gain those skills along the way is the number one objective here. And then also at the end of the study, being able to collate some of those results. Had conversations yesterday during the pilot of the confidentiality associated with this. We tried to pare back as many factors as we could in terms of the data that you would not be able to tell what building it was. Unless you were the first geothermal system in a state, you would not know. That's the nice part about MEP data. It is very nondescript. Other than something like knowing that it is a mass timber building in a particular location, we only gave the state because of different regulations around what you need to model for fire protection, for example, and then the climate zone. But otherwise, there's not much descriptive information, building type, project type, things like that. So we tried to keep it as lean as possible to maintain confidentiality.
Hey, Kaylee, I think Scott, sorry, Scott, I was just gonna ping you. You know, you had mentioned something about office hours that maybe you would chime in on that a little bit.
Well, Kaylee had mentioned that, saying in 2 weeks the next session is going. But Kaylee, I was going to ask if MEP signatories could join those sessions, or do they need to be enrolled in the pilot project to join?
Ideally, we would keep the questions to the individuals who are part of the pilot, so that because they're the ones actually assessing, and then getting their Q&A answered first would be a goal. So that's why we had the sign up for the pilot to kind of keep the study moving, so that those who are actually doing the assessments are able to get their questions addressed in a timely manner. And it's not individuals coming off from the side with no kind of coming in and asking a question. So we really did want people who were dedicated to being a part of the entirety of the study.
But those sessions will be recorded and then posted, so folks can find them if they're not part of the pilot projects.
But we would still be willing to take individual pilot participants at this point, since we're only 1 week in. You haven't missed that much. So if you're interested in joining, feel free to shoot me an email. As let's see, Jamie, you asked a question about data for replacements and service life. We're currently using the tables from ASHRAE. This is where that alignment with ASHRAE in terms of the projects that they're approaching through the Center of Excellence for Building Decarbonization comes in, because we very specifically, I mean, Stet, Luke, and I were all in the initial planning conversations for those projects, that we knew that there are significant gaps for MEP systems in particular around a lot of those life cycle stages after A1 to A3. So knowing, I mean, we need to work with construction individuals on the wastage rates, what is actually realistic for North America, working with ASHRAE on the equipment service life. Those tables are quite old at this point. So trying to figure out some of those determining factors around actual equipment service lives that are more updated, figuring out refrigerant leakage, getting actual measured values rather than prescriptive ones from a table or several different data sets that we could refer to there. So trying to pair together so that we're enhancing the data set that we're using. So around B1 for refrigerants, around B4 for replacements. Luke, looks like you have something to add there too.
Yeah. Both Kaylee and I, we are in the CEBD, so there's maybe I should say after this Orlando meeting, we know whether there will be funding to update that HVAC equipment cycle database, and the plan is submitted already for the funding. Now, but that's just HVAC. There's still like electrical and plumbing and fire protection and the other stuff. So we still need to source those data differently.
Yeah, so the benchmark has values that we grabbed from several different sources to try to piece together the whole MEP side of the building. However, if you have better guidance in your experience in terms of what the service lines are, you are free to change those on your project, or if it would change for a particular topology, those can all be updated by individuals. But we're hoping to kind of keep as much as we can apples to apples with what we know today. And that's the goal.
I'll ask. I just put something in the chat because I've been thinking about it, but and I know we're probably not quite there yet, but is there a point in which once we start learning how impactful some of these categories are, or, material categories, is there a point in which we could start advocating for MEP circularity? I also don't know to what extent MEP elements could be reused. It's not my area of expertise, but I'm just curious if there's any thoughts there.
That is absolutely the direction we want to go in. We want to be able to take into account the D module of life cycle assessment, and thinking about that beyond just, your solar gain emissions that you've got there, but being able to think about the circularity of materials in particular. I saw a really interesting presentation by Francis Yang at Greenbuild, where they were attempting to use old gas line pipes for their piles in their building. So there are opportunities like that in addition to just general recycling potential for MEP systems that we don't know a lot about because I don't think it's being researched that often. I think, Luke, you had a paper by SOM that was done at some point, but that is absolutely the direction that we should be going in, because our systems are replaced so often. I think that is in the goals for the next steps after this.
Yeah, I mean, we are a little behind on MEP. Some of you are in the architecture, the building green sort of communication, and you probably saw a bunch of architecture firms started to look at those. So we are a little behind, but hopefully that's the direction we can all try to move forward to in the future.
I think a great point was made in the chat about where we will be reporting. The purpose of the ECHO project was that we are all reporting in slightly different ways to slightly different databases. And there's a purpose for that, right? Because SE 2050 is going to ask more questions about structural systems than you would need to in a generalized database. So you need this kind of loosely coupled but highly aligned type of strategy for these organizations in terms of being able to get the schemas close where they can be, deviate where they need to, but the ability to have interoperability between them is the goal, because you should be able to port your data across to the ECHO schema very easily. That schema needs to evolve to accommodate these findings that we're having within MEP. Luke and I were both a part of those conversations when we were initially developing the schema, meeting together on a weekly basis. But I think that our understanding of MEP is nascent, and we will continue to develop what it is we think moves the needle. And then those items that move the needle need to go into that centralized ECHO reporting framework for MEP to be properly accounted for, as it's 75% proportion in some cases. So I think that part of the conversation, also big accomplishment on our behalf in terms of getting it to move from the embodied carbon harmonization optimization to actually accounting for more than just embodied, because MEP is more than just embodied. So trying to take to account of more of the life cycle there. But absolutely being aligned with ECHO, that is a part of all of the benchmarking work that we're trying to do. It can be ported across as a schema. So really looking forward to being able to participate in wherever that final database is for the ECHO project.
Maybe do a quick time check for everybody. We're coming to the bottom of the hour here. I think that's a kind of our 90-minute target. But certainly we can stay on a bit longer if there continue to be some questions. Or
thank you all so much for the great discussion. We're looking forward to seeing the outcomes of some of these efforts.
Just one more comment, going back to Scott's comment earlier. TM66 actually has this circular economy of lighting fixture, and they are a little ahead. So I wonder if like any interest in anybody from this team here to start think about using that in North America.
Yeah, I think we're thinking about what that means to expand beyond lighting fixtures and thinking about MEP components more holistically. Well, yes, and Josh's point in the chat, Christy, Josh, and I will be presenting at the ASHRAE Winter Conference on Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. If anyone has the opportunity to stop by or stay for the presentation, we would love to see all of you in person.
Hecklers welcome.
I think the drinks are on Josh, is what I heard.
Chelsea, Rob. Chelsea is back for the drinks.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Drinks on Jaws, it will be all Pepsi and Coke. I don't know whether that's what we want.
Fair point, Luke.
This is what happens when we reach 90 minutes inside jokes.
Right. Well, thank you everyone for participating today. Really appreciate the sort of lively discussion that we've had. Thanks to all the presenters, and thanks for all of you participating in the movement. Right, we've got a lot of momentum. We are looking to accelerate, so we want you all to be part of helping with the push. Thanks again.